Regenerative technology as technology in service to life. Technology in service to sustaining living systems, creating the conditions for more life. To ground that a little bit more, I think about this as an approach to technology that recognizes its interdependency, that serves health, that serves relationships that ensure fairness, that is generally in service to overall care for the earth and community.
Today's episode marks the start of the third and final mini-series of the Regeneration Nexus, focused on the tools, where we explore how technological advances can scale regenerative vision. To kick us off, we speak with Jessica Groopman and Danielle Lanyard, co-founders of the Regenerative Technology Project, who do impressive work at the intersection of emerging technologies and regeneration. I was really inspired by their bigger vision on the ecology of technology as a whole that is relational and rooted in the living systems principles.
This episode really highlights the relationship we have with technology and us thinking, or in some cases not really thinking, about the purpose that we want it to have. Jessica's and Danielle's insight reminded me of the infinite garden metaphor that's often mentioned in the context of Materiom, where technology is something that we collectively and carefully cultivate rather than control, allowing it to grow organically and evolve through collaboration and shared stewardship. Let's dive in. Hi, Jessica and Danielle. Welcome to the ReFi podcast.
Hi there. Thanks for having us.
Hi, Tereza. Hi, Maya. Thank you.
We're so excited to have you both on this episode. Jessica and Danielle are co-founders of the Regenerative Technology Project and are just two trailblazers in the regenerative tech space. We have lots to cover today.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you again for having us. And this is a crazy and wild journey that we're about to embark on, looking at regenerative technology.
Awesome. So, Jessica and Danielle, both from you, I would love to hear your personal stories. So can you share a bit maybe of how you found your way into the regenerative tech space? And perhaps if there was like a moment or experience that really sparked your interest in this work?
Yeah, it's been a long and winding journey, as ever, that probably dates back to my days as an archaeologist, ironically. I first started studying technology looking at the Upper Paleolithic, hundreds of thousands of years ago, in fact. And this has always had me interested in sort of the anthropological implications of us people and our tools. But after that period, I moved out to California and began looking for a role in anthropology. And at the time, what I could find was ethnography in tech companies. So a little bit different, but still some common threads. And began really a study of what are the buying dynamics and human behaviors and user experience implications, and not just the applications of the technologies or the business models of the technologies, but how do we think about these technologies in society? And began a long journey of kind of beginning with enterprise warehousing systems to CRM, customer relationship management, bouncing around to social media and mobile devices, spent quite a long period around the Internet of Things and connected devices, wearables, 5G, of course, blockchain technologies and crypto and digital assets, artificial intelligence. So all of these different technologies over the course of almost 20 years now here in Silicon Valley. And during that period, I've always been a researcher. I've always been looking at, again, what are these implications across technologies? We might call them technology agnostic. It doesn't matter if we're talking about drones or AI or blockchain. There's certain implications and systemic influences that any technology has. So I became very interested in this. That had me studying the digital economy because, well, any technology is within and embedded within the digital economy. And so as a researcher, I was working with some larger organizations around their so-called digital transformation strategies. And these companies were looking at what is the state of the digital economy today and how might we differentiate. Still today, the predominant business model of the internet, as we all know, is one of advertising. And this is a surveillance economics model. So what I was looking at was current state of the digital economy and what might shift. What are other economic models? Even just setting technology aside for a second, what else is out there? And it turns out there's lots of alternative economic models, from looking at well-being economics to ecological economics. I was quite interested in regenerative economics, an economics that restores the health more than it extracts and depletes from the health of an economy and from a whole. But there are many. So I started going down that wormhole of alternative economic models and found myself in a class studying regenerative economics. This is where I met a few of you here, including Danielle, my partner in crime on this project. And what I realized during that period is actually, although there's been much fanfare about the digital economy and all of these sort of digital darlings, these new technological innovations and big tech platforms, actually, they're not so innovative in a really important way. They're not so innovative when it comes to the economy that they're serving. Our physical economy mines from the natural world. Our digital economy mines from the data world, our behavioral data. It does so without asking. It does so without consent. Our physical economy uses machines to optimize for productivity and efficiency and scale. Our digital economy uses algorithms to optimize for productivity and efficiency and scale. Personalization at scale, doing so without a real sense for impacts on future generations, on the broader whole. Our physical economy is a linear economy. It's taking from the ground, it's using things for low durability, and it's putting them into a landfill. Our digital economy is doing the same. It's accelerating the linear economy and also creating, what are we at, 50 million tons of electronic waste every year. And both of these economies are in many ways in service to profits, enriching a small few at a broader cost of a whole. So this was sort of a moment of, wow. So for so long I've been working in technological innovation, but actually there's something really crucially missing from this so-called innovation. And this led me to really ask this question as I was studying the regenerative economy: what might technology for regeneration look like? If we look at technologies as a tool, how could we think about using them in service to life, in service to the health of living systems, whether that's a community system, a social system, an economic system, or an ecological system, and many more? I also looked around and started seeing that, well, regenerative agriculture is a thing, regenerative finance is a thing, regenerative tourism is a thing. And so what about technology, particularly when technology is now infusing all of these other sectors, all of these other things, all of our lives, all of our relationships? So this was the spark for me to shift from just studying a wide range of technologies and their implications to really asking this core inquiry around what about technology in service to life and living systems. So I'll pause there, but that's been my journey.
Thank you, Jessica. Hard to follow up after that, because that was pretty amazing. I'm coming to this space from a completely different path. The regeneration world is not new to me. I was introduced to it in college because I had already developed a holistic living systems perspective just from getting into meditation really early and, frankly, just things like that into Eastern philosophy. So I sought out a environmental studies degree back in the day when you could count all of the available degrees at any colleges on, one or two hands. But there were only 2 colleges in the world that taught it from a living systems perspective, which I knew was the most important thing, not a linear perspective. So I went to this radical college in the middle of the forest, and I was suddenly completely and totally ensconced in living this work while not coming from a background that really taught about any of these things at all. Fortunately, I also got introduced to something rather unusual around alternative economic systems models, because I was living in one of the 11 towns in America that had an alternative local currency. So at age 18, I was doing barter and trading with local economies and local communities just because that was available to us. And we were modeling climate change, back then we called it global warming, in the lab. Every single thing that we modeled in the lab in 1997 has come true today, except it has come true between 5 and 10 years earlier than what our models at the time predicted. I ultimately went on to doing a wide variety of super awesome grassroots sustainable development projects of all kinds, and was just taking it as I went. But I got the travel bug and the green business bug. And what happened was I decided to launch an eco travel platform. I had no background in tech at all. And I did so in the year that the economic meltdown happened in 2008. And I was living in New York City at the time. So it was a hot mess, and my first startup failed. But I got the bug. So I learned how to code. I started getting way into innovation and entrepreneurship. I started producing hackathons. I started to learn how all these different things came together. Then I moved back out to California. And my intention was to take the green startup that I was working on at the time, which was an ecosystem builder around bartering and sharing and helping people grow the green startup ecosystem. But then I broke my shoulder and my rib. And that turned into 8 straight years of medical issues and surgeries. I never expected that would happen. And in between surgery 1 and surgery 2, I tabled my green startup and launched a digital firm. Why? Because I had to pay the bills and because these were my skills. Zoom forward to last year, and I was miserable because tech was really kind of crushing my soul, and I wasn't doing the things that I loved. And fortunately, I got into the Capital Institute Regenerative Economics course, and it was like suddenly I was back to square one in what I loved. Nothing in that course was new to me except one thing, which was the most important thing, which is the human beings that showed up in my cohort. They came from every background and walk of life. That was so new to me. 25 years ago, it was just the radical hippie bohemia people. Now it's everyone. And then I started to realize and understand that technology and sustainability were converging. They were converging in me as an individual, and they were converging in every industry sector the world over. And Jessica, to be perfectly candid, was doing something that I found to be really unbelievably bold, which is trying to take these regenerative principles and apply them into a sector that really was not conducive for these principles. And instead of being afraid of it or not touching it, she went right into the center of it all. And I joined her in this journey because I honestly did not think that there was such a thing as regenerative technology. And over the year and a half that we've been working together on this, I've witnessed a sea change inside myself. And that sea change inside myself went from this sucks to what if? What if this could actually change? And then I started to wonder how this could externalize out into tech in every sector, and how technology could evolve into something that was truly rooted in regeneration principles and also in a living systems approach to life. Because when we do actually build and innovate in alignment with tech and with nature and with a living systems perspective, what we can see is that tech can be this incredible vehicle for change. It's a blessing and a curse right now, but the prospects and the hope around it are huge, and they changed in me, and I believe they can change in anyone.
Wow, fascinating backgrounds. And I love that narrative change to what if, Danielle. And before we jump into defining regenerative technology, I wanted to dive a tiny bit deeper in your backgrounds. So Jessica, you come from anthropology, and I wonder, how does this kind of humanistic approach shape your research work in regenerative technology right now? And maybe why is such an approach important?
Yeah, it's a good question. One I ask myself because I sometimes feel like I can't take the hat off. I think the through line here is, how do humans use, conceive of, design, think about technology as a way to thrive? Are we even thinking about it that way? Is thriving how many of us today would even describe our relationship with technology? But that's been a sort of through line in my career, even going back to the stone tools. What were we using them for? To adapt to situations, to context, to the environment, and also to build forth for future generations. And that is as true today as it was, I'll say 100,000 years ago, because 800,000 years ago, we may not have been the Homo sapiens that we are, or that we think we are today. But aside from that, just taking a wide angle view of, I guess we would call a systems view of that technology is not a separate thing, that we're not a separate thing from anything else. We're not separate from nature. We're not separate from the economy. We're not separate from one another. And this is, I think, an essential starting point for studying any technology, and is absolutely part of regenerative technology insofar as it is oriented around a living systems principles and a living systems view of the world. But most anthropologists are too, or at least they should be. They're trained to be. But I think that those pieces are, I think, the key starting points and the key orientations for rethinking how we use technology to adapt and to thrive.
Beautifully said. And Danielle, your time doing intensive meditation practice and that background that you brought up, I wonder how those inner generation practices, in a way, shaped the way you approach technology today. What's the connection between some of that inner work that you did back then to your work now?
Good question. I'll start with a joke. I often say that my most important skill as a tech builder is my meditation practice, because I know when to step away from the machine when things are not going right and just take a breath and go for a walk. When you build digital products, what have you, there's usually 3 or 4 different separate things that all go into one thing in order to make something live and visible and usable on the web. So what it means is you can't have complete control at any time, because you have web hosting, you have software, you have third-party integrations, and at any time, any one of those things can go down. So you have to have a certain level of anchoredness in knowing that you can't control all of the different elements that go into creating a tech project at any time. The other thing is a holistic and living systems view of life. A lot of what we read and learn in regenerative principles, and it seems like these days everyone and their brother has a set of regenerative principles in their backpack, and they're all great. But one of the things that I have found is that the original wave of this information actually came in the deep ecology field about 25 years ago, with people like Fritjof Capra, Satish Kumar, who used to be the dean of Schumacher College, Vandana Shiva. These are people who were bringing together 2 different gestalts or pantheons of information, one being sustainability or ecology, and then the other being Eastern philosophy. And I have definitely been incredibly steeped in the Eastern philosophy approach, for sure. But what I have found is that it can apply in all different aspects of life. And just being able to see the universe or the world from a holistic standpoint means that you're not going to operate in a linear framework. And it also means that, similar to these regeneration principles, I've also been trained in certain principles around right livelihood, right speech, right action. I don't see them as being any different than the principles that you find in regeneration. Just to give a little hat tip as well to the anthropological points of view that Jessica was describing. One of the things that I find so amazing and beautiful about religion or philosophy, not organized religion per se, but the concepts of them, is that the origin of every one of these different pathways or trajectories of ideas had a code of morality, as well as an understanding that you are your brother's keeper. So I apply that into technology and I say, well, hey, how can we operate with that level of morality in our technology the same way that we did as eco people in the sustainability movement? And what I find is it creates partnerships in different ways that are more diplomatic and egalitarian. It applies a different kind of precautionary principle. That's what we used to call it in the climate movement years ago. But moreover, it's a different orientation. And that's also one of the things that Jessica actually developed through the concept of this regenerative technology, was an ecologies of tech, which is the way of taking this living systems perspective that 20 years ago I would have just said was deep ecology or Eastern philosophy, and now apply it toward technology and innovation. And then the world is endless in possibilities for how things evolve.
Love that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think one point that is very clear is that technology, especially modern technology, has been very associated with extraction and also exclusion, right? So to set the base for this conversation, let's talk about regenerative technology itself. Can you maybe explain how you define it and what sets regenerative tech apart from traditional technologies?
Sure. That's an excellent question. Let's start with technology. Right now, most people, when you say technology, think digital. They think the stuff of the information age. Maybe they think about machines and industrial technologies as well. But I want to invite us to expand that aperture a bit. If we are talking about understanding that we are not separate and that our technologies are not separate, how do we think about technology in a way that is not separate? And so I would offer as a founding definition for technology in a long view, in a way that reconnects us with everything else, as the structuring of the flows of materials, energy, and information to adapt and to thrive. The structuring of the flows of materials, energy, and information to adapt and to thrive. And in this way, there are a lot of technologies, actually. We're going way deeper than digital and industrial technologies, and even thinking and holding social technologies and political technologies and economic technologies, as well technologies of other species, even. Beavers know a thing or two about restructuring the flows of materials and energy and information. So I'll start there because I think it's important that we don't just look at digital. We'll bring in examples today in the digital realm because, again, that's where most people are thinking about technological innovation today. But taking a wider view of technology and seeing the ways in which it interacts with our very trajectory, our very story as human beings is part of this. And we spent some time on this in the white paper about this dance, this interaction, this co-evolution between technology and everything, but technology and humans as well. Okay, so there's tech. We think about, in a simplistic way, regenerative technology as technology in service to life, technology in service to sustaining living systems, creating the conditions for more life. To ground that a little bit more, I think about this as an approach to technology that recognizes its interdependency, that serves health, that serves relationships that ensure fairness, that is generally in service to overall care for the earth and community. So hopefully that grounds a little bit in terms of what is regenerative technology, but I also want to just state very clearly, we are not the arbiters of regenerative technology. This is an emergent field, and just as, let's say in the 80s, if someone said digital, what does that mean? What is digital technology? We could hardly imagine what that would actually come to mean. So this too is regenerative technology is in co-creation. It's in process. It, I would argue, is living itself because it is in constant relationship with everything else. So there's a starting point.
I love taking that wider view on technology, and the beaver example really adds a perspective on how wide this conception really is. But let's try to narrow it down a little bit, right? You mentioned the research paper that you and Danielle have been working on. Can you maybe share a bit more about the research work behind it? Maybe some of your early discoveries that you wanted to highlight, and maybe some of the challenges that you've faced in this research work. And to add on that also, you mentioned that regenerative technology adopts living systems principles. Can you give some examples of what kind of principles?
Of course. The white paper's been a long time in the making, I'll say that. I mean, this is something that I've been studying and slowly piecing together in a research process for going on 5 years now. It's one of those things that, it has to gestate, I suppose. With that said, there has been a tremendous amount of research and dialogue and interviews and observation and going to conferences around this concept. But again, you won't really find very many regenerative tech conferences. You all are engaged in this area, and there are a few others around the world. But again, it's a very emerging space. Having studied emerging technologies for quite a while, when there is little in the way of long-term longitudinal research on an area, the approach or the methodology is to take a wide sweep. So this is something that is the culmination of interviews with people building these technologies, interviews with investors, interviews with folks around regenerative economics, interviews with folks around other economics, going to conferences, being on the ground, going to places in permaculture and in open source, and just sniffing all of these different areas to try to piece together what's going on here. Because again, this is not just sort of studying, agriculture or something. There are a lot of pieces that have yet to be sort of fully embodied and fully brought about. So with all of that said, what the paper really seeks to address is why now? Why regenerative technology in the first place? What's the case for that? We talked a little bit about that in terms of this economic trajectory that we have been mimicking a very extractive playbook with our brand new bright, shiny technologies. So they're unique and they're innovative in terms of their capabilities, but in terms of what they're actually serving and to what ends they're, accumulating, it's kind of the same old stuff. It's kind of the same old playbook. But that's not the end of the story. Part of the case for regenerative technology, of course, is we're on that trajectory even more so with the rise of artificial intelligence and generative AI. And by the way, a lot of other technologies too, virtual reality, cloud, streaming and gaming and blockchain and plenty of other areas that are accelerating the things like the energy footprints of our technologies, the network effects of how much energy is used. We cover concepts like Jevons paradox, for example, in the paper, which looks at when we make things more efficient, we actually tend to consume a lot more of them. And that's sort of one of the things technology is great at. So how do we hold that in our current context of the consumption economy and ecological overshoot and social overshoot, of course? Think about what are the impacts on our communities of our current extractive economy. That's an environmental story from climate change to biodiversity to ocean acidification and far beyond. But it's also a social story in terms of poverty and political voice and access to resources, distribution of wealth, right? So we're holding a lot in terms of what technology is in service to today. And we're also going in the wrong direction in many ways. You mentioned equity in technology. This digital divide piece, yes, more people have smartphones or there's more data being collected about more people, but do they have agency in the development of those technologies? Who decides what's happening in terms of data collection, in terms of distribution of digital assets? Who decides those questions? Right. So the paper really looks at where are we now and where are we going? And that covers, it is a data center computational question, but it's also a lot of other pieces that go into this. Then we look at, okay, well, why regeneration? And why is this different from climate tech or nature tech or food tech or ag tech or all the other techs? So there's I think a real question that we explore of, what makes this different from the standpoint of, yes, we have technologies today from renewables to, crypto assets to biotechnologies that are doing really interesting work that support ecological health, but they're all competing against each other. All technologies are fundamentally embedded in this extractive and competitive and zero-sum economy. So how might projects and people at the end of the day come together and collaborate and coordinate? And so part of that really diving into what is regenerative technology is both putting this on the question of how do we reorient innovation? How do we think about innovation in service to health? What would that look like in terms of metrics? What would that look like in terms of product design? I mentioned the circular economy, for example. What would that look like in terms of which stakeholders are being served, but also in terms of those principles? And you mentioned what are regenerative technology principles? What we ultimately kind of sought to do with this, Danielle mentioned that there are many sets of regenerative principles out there, and they're all great. And there is a need, I think, to both have, I don't want to say standardization, that's not the word, but maybe continuity across different living systems principles, insofar as living systems tend to behave, they tend to have patterns that are outside of us humans. We could fall off the face of the earth and living systems patterns would still be happening. So there is a kind of universality to these. And yet there is also a need for them to be localized or contextualized into different spaces and contexts. So for example, regenerative principles as they apply to biomimicry for product design are quite specific, and they're going to be a little bit different than regenerative principles as they apply to economics, because product design is different than economics. But they all have these kind of, again, universalities. So we sought to both draw from these universal principles, but also not kind of replicate with a completely different set of principles, if that makes sense. But also make sure that they are in the language of many tech builders. So for example, we look at principles like circulatory flows. Circulatory flows in an economic sense would be around the circular economy, right? Moving goods, looking at supply chains. In technology, it includes supply chains and how we think about the life cycle of technology and refurbishment and upgrades and business models that flow into that, but also data. What is the question of the circulation of data? What kinds of questions, for example, we have both sort of a specific living systems principle around circulatory flows and metabolism, and then also how we could think about that as applied to technology. So for example, how would we facilitate distributive information and value flows, promoting information symmetry rather than the asymmetry that we have today? Opportunities for feedback and continuous design and governance that is more circular rather than top-down. So just one example, but that's circulatory flows and metabolism, being adaptive to changing conditions. What does that mean in the context of technology? How do we think about it being place-based? Regeneration happens in place. Technology very often today is global, right? So many businesses, it's all about scale. And it's all about, if not a one-size-fits-all program, designing from above, designing from a set of designers or a set of engineers, and then it's deployed out into the world, rather than really holding what would localization really mean for technology. So how would we localize it to community, to bioregional contexts? How would we kind of avoid or balance against globally imposed models that really lack that local context? What kind of feedback loops are needed to enable that local global flow of information or flow of data? What kinds of, from a material standpoint, how would we think about sharing resources or sourcing materials more locally? Many of the rare earth minerals that go into our smartphones, as one example, travel the world many times before they come into our hands. So again, these are big, gnarly questions, but trying to think about some of these principles in terms of the design of technology and technological applications. So there are several more, but those are a couple. Circulatory flows, place-based, how to be in balance, think about how technologies can help self-organize, enable participation, be more collaborative, et cetera. And then the final part of the paper really looks at, well, what would this look like? If we can hold some of these principles in practice, what are some examples of technologies that are doing this today? We also go into, we can talk about that more. There are several in the paper, and there are 75 on our website. But we also go into trying to imagine what might a new technological epoch actually look like. If what we are coming out of is an industrial or digital in service to an industrial technological epoch, what would a regenerative technological epoch look like? What would be a way of bringing in a wide lens to technology? Final thing I'll say to just sort of orient this, and Danielle mentioned this a minute ago, one of the elements that we pose in the paper is this concept of an ecology of technology. And that is really a way of holding all of this. I've just talked about everything from like data governance to supply chains to user experience to all of the things that come up when we think about technology. What does it mean for our kids? What does it mean to, for grandma to have an Alexa as a companion? There's so much here, right? And so an ecology of technology is an attempt to name that we have to look at technology relationally and look at the relationships between not just tech and its end user. That's sort of where that tends to end today with user-centered or human-centered design. So, but look beyond design. If we currently think about technology today at really the use case level, the design level, tech stack level, how do we go below that and look at the soil? What's going on underneath the principles, the intentionality, the worldviews, the business models that are shaped by those worldviews, the governance models that go into any technology, any of those applications? And then what's above? the use cases and the applications. And that's really how technology is both influenced by our systems, our political systems, our family systems, our economic systems, our ecological systems, and then how it's influencing those systems. I talked about data centers and their footprint. That's a huge influence on ecological systems. Several large tech companies have had to rescind and backtrack on their climate pledges because of how much they're investing in generative AI right now. So this ecology of technology attempts to hold all of this in one place, and it's a lot more than we tend to hold in tech today. But as a lens, that really does cut through the paper of introducing this concept, introducing how we might think about accounting for this stuff in terms of designing technology, and then finally using that lens to think about what would a regenerative technological epic even look like, maybe. And again, we are in co-creation with this. We don't have all the answers at all, but we pose a lot of questions in this report. So I'll leave it there and encourage you to have a read if you like.
I would just like to add something to build upon what Jessica said. I call it a bit of an inconvenient truth, but it's why technology is different. And it's because technology is everywhere. We all have a smartphone now. We're all captured by satellites. None of this is accurate or true for any other field or industry with the exception of technology. And like Jessica just touched upon, every major tech corporation in the last few years has rescinded their environmental pledges or their net zero pledges in order to accommodate for this coming storm of AI. So we can't ignore the fact that all of this is now merging into one big crisis. Yet at the same time, the technology itself holds all the promise in the world to innovate and change all of that. But it does actually include all of us. And what we like to say is that we're not coming here with some techno-solutionism approach. We're living the question. And it's okay to not know the answers. But if we don't start asking the right questions and looking from a more holistic viewpoint into how and why this shift needs to happen and what it would take to make that shift, we won't get to the Emerald City, so to speak, or the holy grail of having an evolved technology or industry. And the other thing too is that given that so many of these climate targets are now getting rescinded because of these new technologies coming in to the fray, we can't ignore this reality, nor can we just accept the fact that any of our individual food tech, ag tech, what have you, is going to save everything. It won't. How I like to describe it is it's one strand in the web. It is a crucial, valuable, super important strand in the web. But it doesn't look at the whole system of how we got here and what the implications are afterward. So how do we look at it from a holistic standpoint that looks at all those inflows and looks at all those outputs and seeks to affect change across the whole system, not just one linear approach? And so that's really how it's quite different. But the reason why the white paper was so important, and I'm saying this even though I complained about writing it the whole time, is because one has to root oneself in a foundation. And if you're trying to create a new category around something, the best way to do it is to stand on the shoulders of those who've come before you and to aggregate all that information into something that will give us grounding to grow upon. And Jessica created all of this, and it was all in her big brain and in her computer. And unfortunately, a person can only handle so much memory and a computer can only handle so much data. I really worried for her that everything was going to bust. And so it was very much a joining of our different approaches and trying to figure out, how do we take this theory and put it into practice? How do we make it accessible to people, and especially tech builders who tend to only look at the tech stack and not the more holistic approach? And how do we encourage people to want to start to adapt toward this approach, given that it's a little uncomfortable? It's uncomfortable to not have all the tools yet. For instance, if you want to dress in the most sustainable way possible, you can make your own clothes. You can go to Goodwill and buy used things. You can source organic materials. In the tech world, we don't yet have all of the best approaches yet. In fact, just this past week, it was announced that, just to speak to the point about data centers, that Microsoft has just signed a deal to reopen up 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island being the location of one of the absolute worst environmental disasters in history. They're going to reopen that now for their data center. So if we wanted to ignore the fact that technology and sustainability are converging, we'd have to have a pretty heavy wool sweater over our eyes, because what's happening right now is happening in real time. And it affects all of us, including all 4 of us on this podcast right now, because we're all using this very technology in order to engage in this conversation. So let us not find ourselves in the perfect being the enemy of good camp, because that camp doesn't get you very far. And let's just be open and collaborative in the conversation, and also be grounded in a theory that we can then put into practice out in the world, even if it's not perfect yet.
And speaking of getting grounded and some of the examples that Jessica, you mentioned, and Danielle, that you brought up, there's definitely a lot there in terms of the big vision. But can you share a bit more about the directory of examples that you have on the Regen Co website? Can you walk us through how you chose some of these case studies of existing regenerative technology projects on the ground? What kind of methodology did you use to accumulate that list?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and one I'm still in inquiry about, to be honest. I have been collecting examples, as I mentioned, really for the past several years, and I want to say a few things about the nature of these examples. What we have on our website are 75 real-world companies and projects, and many of them are for-profit businesses. Many of them are non-for-profit businesses. Many are projects, many are open source. We wanted to provide a variety of different approaches to how technology can be used towards regeneration. A second thing I'll say is that regeneration can mean a lot of different things. So again, this is not just ag tech. There are examples of agricultural technologies, but there are also examples of technologies for economic benefit. There are examples of technologies around 3D printing. There are examples of technologies around ecological credits, again, using blockchain. There are examples across a wide set of use cases, of regenerative use cases, and also of different sectors, as we the classifications that we tend to use, from retail to manufacturing to whatever, food and more. Second thing I would say, or third thing I would say is, this can be slippery. And what we use to define what makes it regenerative was probably where we spent the most time, because that question can change. Companies go bankrupt. Companies' founders with their big visions leave. Companies get bought out by other companies that have very different visions. Business models change, right? Investment can come in, and depending on how that investment is dictated, that creates new metrics and imperatives. So trying to allow for, at least I want to just name that these are not set in stone. Things change. Technologies and these projects are all alive themselves. They are in relationship and in communication with everything that's going on around them. So we wanted to pose these as, here's what it can look like. But I also want to name that can change. And there is no silver bullet here. There's not at least yet, there's not a regenerative technology checklist, because we're all figuring out what this looks like in our quote unquote modern contexts. So just a little bit of sort of caveat to the nature of these examples and how they were selected and just how broad they are, because I think that's really important to hold. Now, with that said, I'll offer a couple that stand out to me across different contexts. So one is an organization called Materiom. Materiom is a biotech platform, and what it is doing is using machine learning, using big data to learn from material science information and attempt to help material scientists and the many brands that employ and work with them to develop bio-based products, to develop bio-based materials. So as many of you may know, many products and materials today are developed with petrochemicals. They're developed ultimately using fossil fuels, but for plastics, for adhesives, for all sorts of different things, insulation for buildings, foams, pesticides, all kinds of stuff. So many different products today are developed. They don't look like fossil fuels, but they're developed using fossil fuels. And Materiom is a digital platform, a biotech platform that is working to enable, essentially to accelerate research and development for biomaterials. But what I think is a couple of things that are interesting about this company from a regenerative standpoint, aside from that they're helping accelerate the shift, they have an open source knowledge repository for these. So this accelerates the whole R&D across different sectors because lots of sectors are using leather. Lots of sectors are using adhesives, right? So a breakthrough in one also can support and enable innovation in another. Another thing that they're doing, I think, is really interesting is optimizing their AI, tuning their analytics to avoid over-extraction. So, for example, if a new algae-based plastic or bioplastic is developed, how do we know that in order to meet this manufacturer's need, that we're not going to then over-extract on this form of algae? So that's a really important kind of, again, this looking more systemically and thinking more systemically. It's not just the material, but where does that material actually come from? And how can we avoid essentially replacing or shifting the over-extraction of fossil fuels right onto the algae? So I think that's an interesting example of a biotech platform that is thinking about this question from several different angles. They're a nonprofit, but they generate revenue through partnerships. So again, kind of hybrid model. Another example, some of you may have heard of this, Ecosia. Ecosia is a search engine that plants trees. They've planted, I can't remember the current number, north of 40 or 50 million trees at this point. But again, it's not just trees in one place. They work with local communities to assess what are the native species that need to most be restored in this particular area that are going to support biodiversity. They also are thinking about this in terms of some of those digital themes that we talked about. They're not selling and monetizing people's data, people's personal data. Advertising by micro-targeting is not their business model. Interesting example, fairly simple example, but totally different from Materiom as a biotech platform. Another example that I think is really interesting is an organization, a digital platform called Fairbnb. Fairbnb sounds like another short-term rentals marketplace you may know and love, but with a really important tweak to their business model. Fairbnb takes 50% of all platform fees and reinvests it locally into the community of that rental. It's also a digital co-op. So the members of these platforms are the local hosts and local organizations. They get to decide how are those platform fees reinvested locally? It's not Fairbnb, the organization, deciding. It's actually a member kind of governed cooperative. And it enables what I think is really critical here, not just kind of fostering local communities, but it enables a more balanced exchange between travelers and the hosts and local communities that they want to visit. We have many examples today of Airbnb that have really kind of gutted local communities, because what's happened is a lot of developers have come in and built these kind of, Airbnb out of a boxes, charged as much as they can, displaced, the other local hosts, and it's created, again, a very extractive impact on many local communities. But Fairbnb offers, again, pretty similar technology, matching algorithms, a digital platform, a marketplace tool, but does so in a way that recirculates, in this case, the value that's being generated through these exchanges. So those are 3 examples. There are many more, and many more across different industries, but there you have a tech example of the search engine, a biotech example that covers a lot of different industries, manufacturing and more, and then Fairbnb that looks at hospitality and rentals and community.
And just to throw a cherry on top of the Fairbnb example, what's so cool about what they do is that because they're a member-owned cooperative and because they're so dedicated toward a sustainable approach to tourism that isn't extractive, they take some of the portions of their revenues and then co-vote together on how those revenues are going to get allocated in the local community for social action projects of all kinds. And if we just take a pause and imagine what Airbnb could have done if they operated on this kind of model 10 years ago, I mean, my brain kind of gets a little lightheaded when I think about the outcome of what has happened because of short-term rental markets and breaking down local communities, my own community being one of them, toward what was possible if they had operated in a more socially egalitarian and regeneratively inclusive way, what could have been. And then you could take out the Airbnb and Fairbnb model and put in Facebook or any other large-scale platform. And then it becomes so clear how and why regeneration is different. So to get back to one of your questions about the directory of initiatives and what makes it regenerative, there is not a checklist per se with one seemingly obvious and clear set of things that either you do or you don't. But it becomes incredibly apparent when you put one up against another, in this case, Airbnb versus Fairbnb. And you can see so clearly how not only are they incredibly different, but when you apply regenerative principles to the same mousetrap, you get a completely different innovation. And that innovation, it serves people, it serves the planet, it serves local communities. It's a whole different beast. And as you can tell, I'm completely on the bandwagon now. And I don't think there needs to necessarily be a silver bullet solution. What needs to happen is the collaboration and the conversation, or as we like to say, the invitation.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a complete no-brainer to me. But I imagine that, and I think it's maybe clear with the examples that you mentioned, that scaling regenerative technologies can be also very challenging. So, and necessary for global impact. So what do you see as the biggest barriers right now? Is it kind of around awareness? Is it around culture, or maybe funding, or something else?
Yeah, there are many. I think about this question in a couple different ways. One is certainly culturally. There are some pretty non-trivial barriers in the tech community. Today, the tech community, by and large, I mean, it's not a monolith, but it is, just to take, for example, investment, the culture of investment. It is short-term returns. It is as fast as possible. It is blitz scaling, for example. It is optimizing for very specific metrics that tend to not center people and planet and communities. It's highly competitive. As I mentioned, we have lots of carbon capture technologies, but they're all competing against one another. So those are really important cultural dynamics that, anytime we have this conversation with technologists, they're like, yeah, but how am I going to do this with my VC funding? And that's very real. That's very real. In many ways, a question to hold is, how can we have regenerative technology without more regenerative finance, without more regenerative economic structures? So I want to name that. I think that's important. And I think another challenge here, and this is kind of a challenge and an opportunity, and I think to some degree goes back to expanding how we think about technology and maybe that ecology of tech, is techno-solutioning. Many technologists view technology as the solution. Many of the kind of luminaries in the tech space view AI as what will fix climate change, for example, or cancer, or poverty, or whatever, as if technology alone is enough. And while we feel strongly that technology plays a critical role, as Danielle was just speaking to, it's more than technology. Technology is the tools in front of human beings creating it. Technology is embedded in our economic systems, as we've been rattling on about. Technology is subject to political forces, to geopolitical forces. That question of how we think about solutions needs not be only a techno-solutionist approach. And even again, that is part of a lot of the culture, and particularly the dominant culture in the tech industry today. We'll just add some AI to it, but there's more to the story there. And so regenerative technology is part of a solution. We think of it as part of a system of solutions, but certainly not the only one. Another challenge and dynamic I want to name that I think is really important is, what would it be to digitize and therefore financialize nature? There's a lot of risks embedded in that question. We're beginning to get a sense of this with things like carbon credits or some eco credits, carbon markets, and some of the ways that ESG is being applied, not to mention the political challenges there. But what does it mean to think that we digitally understand the living world? Could that ever be possible? Would we care if it wasn't possible? we have seen the ways in which technology has digitized our attention, for example. So that to me is a really, really important question around, it's a sort of double bind. It's a challenge. It's a tension of we need to account for the health of living systems. We need to get way smarter about soil health and water and air quality. But can we ever fully understand it? And if we digitize it, are we just going to try to control and manipulate and decontextualize it in a way that we do today? This is part of, again, the worldviews, the layer one, the kind of soil of the ecology of technology, but just we can't digitize the sacred. And when we're talking about the living world, we're talking about some sacred elements that are constantly moving. So that's a piece. It's a little bit different than techno-solutionism, but it's in there. It's in there.
This is actually the piece that gives me the most hope, because our technologies are not made in a vacuum. They are made at the hands of human beings. And if anyone has ever hugged a tree, which I like to do quite often, I'm a proud out tree hugger. Hold a tree and you are experiencing energy that goes back generations and generations and generations. And it's palpable. And at the same time, all of our technologies are built with people, but the technologies themselves cannot feel. And so what that means is that we have a huge opportunity with humans to evolve in such a way that humans change the technology because we're the ones building it.
Yeah, reminder for all listeners out there, don't forget to hug a tree today. But speaking of financializing nature, something that you brought up, Jessica, blockchain is oftentimes mentioned in these conversations. And I'm curious, can you share a bit, where do you see blockchain playing a role in regenerative technology specifically? And what is your personal relationship with Web3? And maybe within that, if you want to share your thoughts on the ReFi community, specifically within the Web3 ecosystem.
Absolutely. Yes. And thank you for this question. I think blockchain plays several critical roles here. I just wrote a chapter in a book that is looking at digital platforms for regeneration. And blockchain can be an enabler of all three of what I see as kind of three macro opportunities for what we can do with digital platforms to support regeneration. And one is around coordination and localization. How do we get many disparate parties who may or may not trust each other, who may or may not agree with each other, to come together around information, around a marketplace, around a need for, let's, for example, say ecosystem restoration? That is, I think, one of the best tools that we have in our toolkit from a digital perspective. So coordination and collaboration, absolutely. The second area is around localization. Blockchain can play a role in helping bring digital assets, digital contexts, digital services, digital marketplaces, digital offerings, value generally, more localized. I think of the work of Regen Network as one example, blockchain-based, with a great insight that while carbon credits are important, actually we need a wide diversity of ecological, what they call eco-credits, right? How do we think about what is an eco-credit in this particular bioregion? Maybe soil health needs to be restored here, but maybe it's air quality over here, different. And they're doing work now, in working around biodiversity credits, because that's crucial for the Amazon rainforest, for example. So that's a really interesting example of, again, localization that blockchain can help enable by coordinating these different parties, but asking what is the specific need of this local place, but how do we get all of the global stakeholders to recognize and respond to that need and agree on that this is an information asset, a digital asset that represents this thing. And then the third area is around network effects. I mean, as we've seen with, for example, Ethereum and many digital platforms. But how do we think about creating these very large open ecosystems that are not pay to play, that are not necessarily advertising based, but have a draw in a way that by more nodes, more people, more projects participating in a particular, let's call it a digital economy, because many blockchain ecosystems are, that it's a draw, that that's an attractor in and of itself, and that creates a network effect. And the big nut here, or one of the big nuts to crack here, is how do we turn the incentive models around? How do we turn incentives such that everybody is, collaborating and competing to restore ecosystems, to distribute wealth more effectively, too, right? All of these different kind of use cases that we talked about in some of the examples. And having these structured digital economies that allow for network effects in a positive direction, I think are another really kind of killer, I hate to use the term, but maybe a living app instead of a killer app for blockchain to support with. As for my personal relationship with Web3, I'm not sure if anyone's ever asked me that question, but it goes way back. I started studying blockchain before we called it Web3, way back in like 2013, 2014, the early proto days, and have been watching the space go through its evolutions, its seasons, if you like, its winters and its springs. And I mean, I'm fascinated by it. I don't, we all know blockchain in the, general Web3 ecosystem, as we've come to call it now, has shady parts of town, and it has very hopeful and optimistic parts of town. To me, the toothpaste is out of the tube in terms of what this technology enables. The big question, and actually blockchain is kind of a case study of this. The big question is how people want to use it and how groups come together and coordinate around it. So I would say my relationship with Web3 is healthy. I'm sort of watching happily to see it grow. And in particular, ReFi, the community of regenerative finance, of #ReFi, kind of the blockchain answer to this, I think is one of the most important communities in the regen tech space because, well, there aren't that many. And already we have a community here that recognizes just how powerful technology can be towards restoring communities, towards restoring equity, towards remediating ecosystems, some of these kind of climate and nature tech applications we talked about, towards, how do we affix value to undervalue things and use this technology to do so? So yeah, really excited to join you all for this today and to further engage with this ecosystem. You guys are doing the work and help paving the way of what regenerative technologies can actually look like.
That's beautiful, and a huge compliment to the ReFi community. But I guess let's not sleep on a bed of roses either. There's still a big, amount of work to be done. But I'm curious if blockchain, I also want to learn about your thoughts around AI, because AI is obviously a huge tech kind of trend that's also kind of getting people from maybe that are not that tech savvy normally, like my mom is using ChatGPT already. So it's a tech that's getting a lot of traction, but there's also a lot of responsibility. And I want to throw this question out there. What does it mean for AI to be regenerative? And can you envision a specific example of that?
We're figuring that out. And I think holding that AI AI like blockchain enables infinite numbers of use cases, right? From, let's say, AI is a crucial technology to enabling more effective circularity, right? Sorting waste more effectively, not having people have to do that job is a computer vision exercise. AI is crucial to network effects and these matchmaking, some of these pieces we've talked about of connecting, let's say, change makers or ecosystem remediators to each other, to other parts of the marketplace that need their services but don't know they exist. AI is a core technology for that. I think about open source and what does it mean for us to open source different AI agents and AI frameworks. And again, there's risks there as well, but this is also part of how do we reset some of these business models? How do we get tools that are attuned to less extraction into the hands of more people, into underserved countries and communities? I think about AI in terms of, satellite imagery. And again, another computer vision application, the way that we are now monitoring our environments in ways that we were never doing before. We still have a lot more data about our social media and transaction behavior than we have about our own planet. But again, AI is helping with that. AI through satellite imagery and triangulation and big data and ocean information is also beginning to help us better understand the patterns and the rhythms of different ecosystems. And we need that. That's more information than any brain can hold. And it's true that AI, particularly our latest generation of AI, has a radically greater energy, environmental, and social impact than the prior generations. And as we've talked about at length already, that's only expected to increase. So that is a huge tension with the use of AI. I'm heartened by that. What tends to happen, and blockchain again is a case study of this, what tends to happen when there is immense computational footprint in say, a new technology, is it invites innovation to reduce that footprint. So Bitcoin blockchain was an ecological, disaster. And then came a whole range of other consensus algorithms, other consensus mechanisms that had a far lower footprint or were far more localized or just were totally different ways of creating matrices of computing. I'm quite confident it's already happening, and edge computing is part of this story as well. But I'm confident that AI's computational footprint will become more distributed because it has to be. And again, this generative AI wave and generation is an invitation for all kinds of innovators to do that, because it's actually not really good for anyone. It's not cost effective either to do this. We're not there yet. And as Danielle mentioned, there are massive investments going into massive data centers. And, this trajectory is very strong, but action reaction in many ways. So AI is a mixed bag. They're all mixed bags.
Yeah, I have to concede I'm a little more plagued about the AI wave than Jessica is. I have only come to really dive into the statistics when we started to write our white paper together. And as someone who's a diehard environmentalist, I was taken aback by what I was seeing. Even just simple things like a Google search takes this amount of energy. A Google search with AI takes 10 times as much. All of the major tech companies in the last 2 years rescinding all of their net zero pledges solely so that they can accommodate the AI wave. But to then come back, kind of like a yin and the yang, or a crisis and opportunity, Jessica mentioned open oceanographic mapping of the world's oceans. That was actually the first environmental project I worked on as a teenager at NOAA. And back then, we were literally physically holding the maps and entering them into the one computer program that could accommodate that data. That same process that took years and years and years and years and more human hands than one can give credit for can now be done with an AI tool in a matter of minutes. So what it says to me is that somehow we need to not put the cart before the horse, or let everything out of the bag, so to speak, because the toothpaste is already out of the tube, as Jessica said. But we have a big problem here. And I have been doing my own little naturalistic study over the last couple of months, just asking my diehard sustainability folks what they know about the environmental footprint of AI. And most people had no idea that this was actually happening. So it speaks to both a lack of awareness and also a door of opportunity. Because once you know, you can't unknow. And there are so many different opportunities right now to leverage technology and to also increase our awareness, be it through AI or however we get exposed to new information, and to then build a better mousetrap. I absolutely refuse to believe that this is the best that humanity can do. We can do better. And if we just choose to be a part of a different kind of conversation and collaboration, then we can find a different approach. And it may not be a single approach, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it is possible. And we have all of the tools at our disposal to innovate in that direction. So here we go. Game on.
Thanks for offering sober take on the realities of today's AI and blockchain's development. And let's just hope that some of the leaders and people behind building these tools are going to read your white paper and engage with the work on regenerative technology. And before we wrap up, we would like to end with some rapid fire questions. Feel free to answer as briefly as you'd like. And I'd love to hear from each of your perspectives. Let's start with you, Jessica. What book are you currently reading?
Ooh, I am reading Ways of Being by James Bridle, which I highly recommend.
Danielle, what book are you currently reading?
Well, I am currently reading the incredibly light fare Ministry of the Future. I don't know if you've read it or not. It's Kim Stanley Robinson's book about science fiction alternative reality and what the world looks like when we lose the fight for climate change and the temperature gets so hot that adaptation is not possible. And I'm only halfway through, so I don't know how bad it gets, but it's pretty daunting already, I'll be honest with you.
I want to know what excites you the most about your work.
Well, you can't be too upset and sad about the state of things when you're actively working to improve it. The other thing is working with folks like you. When I'm doing work I love and I'm engaging with folks like you, I learn things I wouldn't learn otherwise. I get pushed and challenged in ways that force me to think differently. And also it's a reminder to me of what a beautiful world we have, just by nature of the different kinds of human beings that are in it and the different kinds of thought processes that people from different backgrounds adopt and put out into the world. So it makes me more resilient as a human being, but also more open to different ideas and different ways of thinking.
Thank you, Danielle. And Jessica, how about you? What excites you the most about your work?
What excites me the most about this work is that it is everywhere. It's both nowhere because not many people know what regenerative tech is if you say regenerative tech, but it's everywhere in that, millions of technology workers, billions of people using these technologies are looking for something a little bit more. I know many friends and people who are in search of technologies and ways of using and relating to technologies that bring in more meaning and allow for more than just endless scrolling and addiction and extraction and linearity, et cetera, et cetera. And also that it's because it's so emerging, it's something that we can all have a role. In some ways, we are at the beginning of, we've finished phase 0 of digital. Now we're ready to grow up a little bit.
And the final rapid fire question, Danielle, what's the one lesson, quote, or mantra that has shaped you the most as a person?
That's easy. Do no harm. And it's been that way since I was a teenager. And in the early days of environmental world, the precautionary principle was it as far as how we innovate. And it never got adopted, no matter how much the leading activists around the world tried to bring it into the UN. And I wonder how principles like that could get adopted now into technology and innovation. I'm not saying that technology and innovation shouldn't reach the market, but if we operated with the principle of do no harm, maybe it would take longer for certain technologies to enter the market so that they could be more socially and environmentally responsible in their approach. And I would be quite okay with that.
Oh, definitely very relevant. And how about you, Jessica?
That's much harder for me. What comes to mind for me now is a quote by Lean Gorison: the nature of the future of innovation and innovation of the future of nature are interconnected.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Well, Jessica and Danielle, thank you also so much for being here today with us. It was a very insightful conversation. And what I take away is that there are ways we can build technology in service of life. So we definitely look forward to keeping up with your work in the future.
Thank you all so much for having us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thank you both for your incredible work and for creating this space for us to talk about it.
And thank you for your inspiring work. And I can't wait to read the white paper. And for all of our listeners, make sure to check out the Regenerative Technology Project. We'll make sure to include the link in the description of the episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.